Welcome to the channel. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button so you don't miss any more shocking and captivating stories. Enjoy watching. Mark was a man of routine. Every day, like clockwork, he would leave for work at the same time, return home at precisely 6 p.m., and sit down for a quiet dinner with his wife Emily. They had been married for nearly 6 years, and to the outside world, they seemed like a perfect couple. Mark worked as a software engineer in a mid-sized tech company, while Emily worked part-time as a graphic designer. They lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Massachusetts, in a modest house with a well-kept lawn and a white picket fence. But beneath the surface, Mark began to feel something shift. It started as a small feeling in his chest, an unsettling nagging that he couldn't quite place. Over the past few months, Emily's behavior had changed subtly. Her laughter didn't reach her eyes as it used to. The conversations they once shared had become sparse, filled with uncomfortable silences. She had also started staying out late more often, citing work deadlines or client meetings, but Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. One night, a Wednesday, Mark returned home early from a business trip. He had decided to surprise Emily with dinner from their favorite restaurant. As he stepped into their home, he noticed the faint scent of perfume in the air, an expensive one that wasn't hers. Mark stood in the entryway for a moment, staring at the living room. The door to their bedroom was slightly ajar. A muffled sound reached his ears, soft voices, and a sound that almost sounded like laughter. He froze. His heart beat faster. He had never thought he would feel this way, paranoid, suspicious of his own wife. But there it was. He walked quietly toward the bedroom, his every step deliberate. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the thought gnawed at him. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was all in his head. Mark peeked around the doorframe, and what he saw made his stomach churn. Emily was sitting on the edge of the bed, her hair tousled, a look of surprise on her face. But it wasn't the look she had when Mark would come home early from work. It was the look of someone caught off guard, of someone who had been doing something they shouldn't have. Two men sat on the bed with her, one on either side. Mark didn't recognize either of them, and that made the weight of the moment even heavier. The first man, tall with a rugged look, had his arm around Emily's shoulders, while the second man, shorter and more polished-looking, was laughing at something Emily had just said. Mark didn't say anything. He just stood there, his breath shallow, trying to piece together what he had just witnessed. It wasn't a fantasy. It wasn't a trick of the light. Emily's eyes met his for a brief moment, but she didn't stand up, didn't make any move to explain herself. "Mark," she said, her voice shaky. "You're home early." That was it. The only thing she could think to say. For a long moment, Mark said nothing. His mind raced. His body was stiff. The room seemed to close in on him. His wife, his partner for all these years, was sitting there with two men laughing, talking, and clearly more than just friends. He wanted to scream, to confront her, but a part of him, the part that still loved her, the part that wanted to believe in their marriage, held him back. He forced himself to take a breath, his voice low. I didn't know you had company." His voice sounded almost robotic, detached. The tall man who had been sitting closest to Emily stood up and quickly grabbed his jacket from the chair. "Sorry, man. We were just leaving," he said, his voice thick with awkwardness. The second man, the one who had been laughing, stood up as well. His face was flushed, his demeanor suddenly tense. "Yeah, we didn't mean to." He cut himself off when he saw the expression on Mark's face. Emily just sat there, her lips pressed together, looking like she was caught in a lie too big to escape. "Please," Emily said softly. "Can we talk about this?" Mark didn't answer right away. He turned and walked out of the room, his mind reeling. The sounds of their footsteps faded as the door shut behind them, and Mark was left standing in the hallway, his chest tight, his thoughts scattered. He had thought he had been imagining things. He thought he had been paranoid. But now, the evidence was right in front of him. He couldn't deny it. His wife had been lying to him, and worse, she had been unfaithful. Mark couldn't bring himself to go back into the room. Instead, he grabbed his coat, walked out the front door, and drove aimlessly through the streets, his mind consumed with the image of Emily with those two men. He didn't know where he was going, only that he needed to get away. He didn't want to confront her just yet. Not until he had a clearer head. As he drove, Mark thought back to all the moments he had missed, the small signs he had ignored. He thought about the late nights, the secretive texts, the way she'd seemed so distant lately. All the things he had brushed off as work stress or her being tired now seemed like nothing more than a series of excuses. By the time he made it back home hours later, Mark was exhausted. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't even look at Emily the same way anymore. She had tried to call him several times, but he ignored her calls. He had to figure out what to do next. Mark spent the following days in a state of cold detachment. His mind was a constant whirl of images, memories, and questions. The man who had walked in on his wife with two strangers no longer felt like the same person he had been before. He had lost something: trust, innocence, belief in the stability of his life. Emily, on the other hand, seemed to be doing everything she could to restore some semblance of normalcy. She called him several times, each message a mix of apologies, explanations, and pleas for understanding. But Mark wasn't interested in talking. He wasn't interested in hearing excuses. Every time he heard her voice on the other end of the line, it only reminded him of the betrayal he had witnessed. She had failed him. And as much as he hated the thought of it, he felt like he was losing her. She was slipping away, and he didn't even know how to grasp hold of her anymore. It wasn't until the weekend that Mark finally gathered enough courage to face Emily. He had been putting it off, distracting himself with work, even staying later than usual at the office. But the emotional weight of it all had become too much to bear. He couldn't hide from it any longer. Saturday afternoon, he returned home from a trip to the hardware store, his arms full of tools he didn't need. Emily was sitting at the kitchen table, her hands folded nervously in front of her. She looked up when he entered, her eyes red, like she had been crying for hours. Mark had no patience left for tears. He put the tools down on the counter and leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. "We need to talk," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. He hated how cold he sounded, but he couldn't help it. There was too much anger bubbling under the surface, and if he let it out, he feared it would consume him. Emily nodded, biting her lip, but said nothing. Mark motioned for her to speak first, wanting to hear what she had to say. "I know you're angry," she began, her voice shaky. "And I know I've been distant, but Mark, you have to understand. There's been a lot going on, and—" "Stop," Mark interrupted, cutting her off. "I don't want to hear your excuses, Emily. I don't care about a lot going on. I saw it. I saw everything. You didn't even try to hide it." Her face fell. She stood up, pacing back and forth in front of him, trying to find the right words. "Mark, I never wanted to hurt you. It wasn't about you. It was about me. About things I didn't know how to deal with, and I don't know what happened. I was confused and I made a mistake. But it's over. It's all over now." Mark stared at her, feeling the tightness in his chest. He had never imagined he'd be standing in his own kitchen, listening to his wife try to justify what had happened. "You were confused. With who? The guy on your bed or the other one who was sitting next to you?" Emily flinched at his words, her eyes welling up with tears. She seemed lost for a moment, then took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for the confession she knew was coming. "It wasn't just one time, Mark," she whispered. "It's been going on for months. I didn't mean to fall into this. It was one mistake, and then it just snowballed. It's not what I wanted. I love you, Mark." Mark's heart dropped into his stomach. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. The air in the room felt heavy. He didn't want to hear this. He didn't want to hear that it wasn't just a one-time lapse in judgment. He had known something was off, but hearing her admit it, hearing her confess in such a hollow, apologetic way, it felt like a dagger in his chest. "I love you too," he managed to say, though the words felt foreign in his mouth. "But love isn't enough, Emily. You've broken me, and you've broken us." She reached for him, but he stepped back. His chest felt tight, suffocating. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice rising now, tinged with pain. "It's not about your confusion. It's not about whatever excuses you're trying to make. It's about trust. It's about respect. And I don't have either of those anymore." He ran a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of the situation pushing him down. It felt unreal, like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. "How had they gotten here? Mark, please," Emily said, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. I never meant for this to happen. You have to believe me." Mark shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "I believed you when you told me you loved me. I believed you when you promised me things would be okay. I believed you when we said vows to each other. But that was before you decided to lie to my face." But tears welled up in his eyes, but he fought them back. He couldn't cry, not now. Not when everything inside of him was breaking. "You can't undo this, Emily. It's done," Mark said, his voice low, almost broken. "You've made your choice." The days following that conversation between Mark and Emily passed in a blur of tension and unresolved emotions. Mark had expected to feel a sense of relief after confronting her, but instead he was drowning in confusion. Emily had begged for his forgiveness, promised she would change, that everything could return to normal if only he would give her another chance. But every word she said felt hollow now, like the echo of someone who had failed him. Mark spent the next few days avoiding her. He stayed at work late, took long walks around the neighborhood, and even started staying at a friend's house to escape the suffocating reality of their home. He needed space. Space to think, space to breathe, space to decide what came next. But the question that weighed on him was simple: could he forgive her? Could he rebuild what had been shattered? One evening, as Mark was sitting on the porch of his friend's house, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Emily. "Please, come home, I need to talk to you, I'm sorry. We can fix this, I promise." Mark stared at the message for a long time. A part of him wanted to go back to fix things, to believe her. But another part of him, the part that felt betrayed, screamed for him to stay away. He knew if he went back, there would be no going back from it. He would either have to forgive her completely and start anew or walk away for good. Mark took a deep breath and, without thinking, he typed his reply. "I'll be home in an hour." When he arrived, the house was eerily quiet. Emily was sitting at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she clutched a glass of water. Her face was pale, eyes bloodshot from crying. The look she gave him was desperate, pleading, like she was hanging on to the last thread of their relationship. "I've been thinking about everything," Emily said, her voice shaky, but there was a hint of resolve in her tone now. "Mark, I know I've hurt you. I know what I did was unforgivable, and I don't expect you to just forget it. But I can't lose you. I don't want to lose you. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." Mark stood by the doorway, his body tense. His heart was racing. He wanted to scream at her, to tell her how much she had ruined him, but instead he stayed silent. His emotions felt like a storm inside him, too chaotic, too wild to control. He watched her for a long time, her eyes searching his face, waiting for a response. And then it hit him, the truth of the situation. All of his doubts, his lingering questions, had led him to one conclusion: this was never going to work. He could never trust her again. He would always wonder, always doubt, always feel that gnawing suspicion in the back of his mind. The love they once had was gone, replaced by something ugly, something painful. He took a deep breath and finally spoke. "Emily, I don't think I can forgive you. I don't think I can move past this." Her face fell, and she stood up, taking a step toward him. "Mark, please, don't do this. I'll change, I swear. I'll go to therapy, we'll work through it. I can fix this. You just have to believe in us." Mark shook his head. "I did believe in us. I believed in you, and you broke that. You broke me." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "This isn't just about what happened with those guys. This is about everything. The lies, the distance, the way we've been drifting apart for months. You may think you can fix it, but I can't go on pretending that things can just be the way they were." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes, but she said nothing. She reached out for him, but Mark stepped back, his body tense with the effort to resist the pull of her touch. "I don't love you the way I used to," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't. I don't know if I ever will again." Emily collapsed into a chair, her face buried in her hands. Mark felt a pang of sympathy for her, but it wasn't enough to change his mind. This wasn't a decision he could make out of guilt or out of fear of being alone. This was about self-preservation. He had to leave. He had to walk away. "I think it's time we end this," Mark said, his voice firm now. "You need to go. I can't live here anymore." The silence in the room was deafening. Emily didn't speak. She just sat there, staring at the floor, her body trembling as if she had just realized the full weight of what was happening. Mark stood there for a moment longer, as if waiting for something, maybe a sign, maybe a last-minute change of heart. But there was nothing. Nothing that could undo what had already been done. "I'll be back tomorrow to get my things," he added, his voice steady. "You should start packing." With that, Mark turned and left the kitchen, his footsteps heavy with finality. As he stepped out the door, he closed it softly behind him, like closing the chapter of a book he had long since stopped reading. The following days passed in a blur of logistics and painful decisions. Mark had already moved his things into a small apartment just a few blocks away, a place that felt like a temporary refuge, though it offered no real comfort. His mind was numb, disconnected from the emotional devastation that had once been so all-consuming. He spent most of his time at work, pouring himself into his projects just to keep from thinking about Emily, about the life they had built together, and the irreparable damage that had been done. Emily had tried to reach him several times in the days after he had told her it was over. She called, sent texts, and even showed up at his apartment, standing in the doorway, begging him to reconsider, to talk things through. But Mark never opened the door. He couldn't bring himself to engage with her anymore, not after everything, not after the betrayal. One evening, about a week after he had moved out, Mark received a phone call from a mutual friend, Sarah. She was a close friend of both him and Emily, someone they had spent many weekends with over the years. Sarah's voice was soft on the other end of the line, a mixture of concern and hesitation. "Hey, Mark, I just wanted to check in with you," Sarah said. "I know things have been tough, and I understand why you're angry, but I think you should know something." Mark felt a slight tightness in his chest, as though he had already guessed what was coming. He sat down at the small table in his apartment, bracing himself. "What is it, Sarah?" She's not taking this well, Mark. Emily's really struggling. I know you're hurt, and I get it, but she's been—" Sarah paused, choosing her words carefully. "She's been talking about leaving, like for good. She says she can't live without you. She says she'd do anything to make it right." Mark closed his eyes, rubbing his temples. The idea of Emily trying to piece her life back together while he struggled to keep his own together, it was overwhelming. The thought of her suffering, of her regret, made him feel nothing, at least not in the way he once would have. His anger and hurt were like a wall now, an impenetrable fortress between them. "I'm not going back, Sarah," he said quietly. "I can't, I know," Sarah replied, her voice tinged with sympathy. "I just thought you should know. I'm not taking sides, Mark, but I hate seeing her like this. She really loves you, even if she messed up. You know that, right?" Mark exhaled slowly. "I don't think she loves me the way I need her to, Sarah. Love isn't just about saying the right things or making promises when you're caught. It's about respect, trust, and she doesn't have either of those anymore." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Mark could hear Sarah's deep sigh. "I get it," she finally said. "I just wish things were different." Mark thanked Sarah for checking in, then ended the call. He didn't feel any sense of closure. He didn't feel any sense of victory either. The decision was made, but the pain of it still lingered. What was left now? Just the quiet aftermath. He had to move on, and he didn't know how. That evening, as he sat on his couch, a knock came at the door. Mark hesitated for a moment, unsure if he wanted to deal with anyone right now. He stood up and walked to the door, opening it to find Emily standing there, her face pale and drawn, her eyes swollen from crying. She had been at his door more than once over the past week, but this time something felt different. There was no pleading, no desperation in her expression, just exhaustion, and a certain finality. "Mark, please just listen," she said, her voice shaky. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do anymore. I don't know how to fix this, but I'm here. I just want to talk. Please." Mark's heart was heavy as he looked at her, but he knew that anything he said now wouldn't change what had already happened. There was nothing to say, no words that could undo the betrayal. The man he had been, the husband he had been, he could never go back to that. "Emily," he began, his voice hoarse. He stopped, swallowed, then continued. "I don't want to hurt you, but this is over. I can't do this anymore. I'm done." The words felt final, like the last breath of a long, painful chapter. Emily closed her eyes as if accepting the inevitable. She let out a deep, shuddering breath, and for a moment, they just stood there, neither one of them moving, both feeling the weight of the past few weeks like a suffocating fog. "I never meant to destroy us," she whispered. "I was selfish, I was confused, and I made mistakes. But you're right, love isn't enough if there's no trust." Mark nodded, his chest tight. He felt a pang of sorrow for what they had lost, for the life they could have had. But in the end, he had to accept that it was over. It was no longer about what they could have been. It was about what they were now, two people, living separate lives, both scarred in their own ways. "Goodbye, Emily," Mark said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily nodded, her tears falling silently now. She turned to walk away, her steps slow, heavy with the finality of the moment. Mark watched her walk down the hallway, out of his life for good. The door clicked shut behind her, and he stood there for a long time, listening to the silence. It was over. The life he had once known had come to an end. The future that had once seemed so certain was now a distant memory. Mark didn't know what would come next, but he knew he had to keep moving forward. He had to rebuild, and in time he would.